Welcome, everyone, to First Ladies, The True Story. I'm Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. I'm delighted to welcome you today. This program is being recorded and will be posted at a later time on the Arlington County 55 Plus YouTube channel. We are a little bit backlogged, but hopefully we'll catch up and this program will be available on the YouTube channel. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that only she will appear in the recording. I'm delighted to welcome Park Guide Tara Bostetter, who is coming to us live from the National First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. And Ranger Tara is here to help us get to the bottom of the true story, to set the historical record straight on some controversial aspects of First Lady history. So please join me in welcoming Ranger Tara. We will allow time for questions at the end. You're more than welcome to enter them in the chat as we go, but they will be addressed at the end. So please join me. I'm delighted you could be here, and I'm going to turn it over to Ranger Tara.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ranger Tara, and I am from the First Ladies National Historic Site located in Canton, Ohio. We are one of the 8 national parks located in Ohio. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint presentation here. All right. So, like I said, I am from the First Ladies National Historic Site located in Canton, and we have 2 buildings here. One is our visitor center or education center posted on the right there. So we are actually located in the old City National Bank building, and it has been completely restored. It is the original building. And this is actually where President William McKinley did a lot of his personal transactions at. So located in here, we have our visitor center, which currently has an exhibit on Jackie Kennedy. Our exhibit rotates at least once or twice a year. So if you come back every year, you'll see something different. And then, of course, we have all of our archival storage and then our office spaces in this building as well. And then we also own the Saxon House building. So that is where First Lady Ida Saxon McKinley, she is going to live in this home. It'll be constructed in 1840. And President William McKinley will also live in this house for about 20 to 25 years after they get married. But besides that, it's her family home. So as park rangers, we talk about her legacy as First Lady, her time in Canton before, during, and after her time as First Lady. And today we'll be talking about Ida as well. So we're going to be talking about a couple of the First Ladies of the United States. That's what our site mainly focuses on. So the program we're going to be talking about today is Truth Seeker. So kind of getting down to sort of some of the myths that are told even in our history classrooms today. So one of the challenging things about studying women's history is the lack of information. So for the longest time, it was actually considered improper for women to sort of engage in record keeping of their own lives. So it was improper for women to keep journals or diaries or anything like that. In fact, First Lady Martha Washington, she actually burned all of her personal letters between herself and George Washington after his death. So it's kind of hard for us as we're going through the history of the First Ladies because a lot of the records just aren't sort of there. So today we're going to look at some controversial aspects of 4 different scenarios. So the first one we'll start with is who should be credited for saving George Washington's portrait. So our First Lady that we'll talk about first is Dolley Madison. So she's going to serve as First Lady of the White House from around 1809 to 1817. And she's often referred to as Queen Dolley. She's known for her political knowledge, and she's really hosts a lot of elegant receptions at the White House. She actually learns a lot about what Martha Washington and Abigail Adams did before her, and she wants to take that one step further. So instead of hosting sort of like quiet dinners at the White House, she is going to be hosting quite vocal, flamboyant, and very strategic things at the White House. So she's a little bit of a different first lady. So essentially every Wednesday, Dolly Madison is going to be hosting drawing room receptions, and these were basically intentional for forging social networks. So what she's going to do is she's going to expand the guest list. So before, it was men and women that were of the upper class were only invited to the White House, but instead Dolly is going to expand this, and she is going to have, she's not going to have seating charts. The guests can sort of mingle, and this is going to expand to basically all social groups located in Washington. So the guest list gets quite large, and Dolly is actually going to work with her husband. They worked very well together, and basically what's going to happen is he is going to attend these gatherings and use them as opportunities to basically kind of like test the waters, he would say, on these social issues that he would be pushing through Washington. So once it was kind of clear where James Madison was going to go on a particular issue, Dolly would be basically his go-to person for lobbyists. And she could basically persuade all of Washington, D.C. on a certain issue. That's how influential she was during this time as First Lady. So now that we kind of have a background of her, we'll talk about what this kind of question is going to be centered around. So while Dolly Madison was First Lady, the nation was involved in what we refer to as the War of 1812. So it was fought of basically over the British and American expansion, among many other reasons. But essentially, in 1814, British troops are going to make their way over to Washington, D.C. And the First Lady and the President are going to remain in town to sort of show their strength for other residents of Washington, D.C. and sort of like the whole country, like the British are coming, but we are making this front as the United States. But by that same year of August 24th, the British are actually attacking Washington, D.C. at the White House. So the president is already aware of what's happening. He is going to leave with his troops, but First Lady Dolly Madison is going to be one of the last people to leave the White House. And as the story goes, according to many newspaper resources, the First Lady saved the very famous Gilbert Stuart full-length portrait of George Washington. It's probably the one that you guys have seen on like the History Channel, or any photo that you see of George Washington is probably going to be this famous portrait. So this is just kind of a quote that I'll let you guys read, but essentially this is her taking what is happening at this thing. So she is going to say she's going to hasten her departure. She knows the British are coming, but she is not going to leave without this very famous George Washington portrait. And essentially it says, you know, that she had this idea, she's going to take it out of the frames and have it, and she's not going to leave the White House without this portrait with her. And we have some very famous, this story is extremely famous. We have all these 3 photos right here. So this is all depictions of local newspapers, even today, you know, graphic novels that we have of Dolly being this savior of history of sort, that she had this brilliant idea to save what is one of our most iconic, you know, pieces in the White House today. So this will be talked about for generations to come. They even still make stuff about it today, you know, articles, newspapers about it. So Dolly was extremely popular. However, as the time goes on, we have Paul Jennings, who's pictured right here. So he is a 15-year-old. He was actually enslaved by the Madisons while they were in the White House. And he actually wrote down what happened that night. So after gaining his freedoms, Jennings is actually going to go on and publish his White House memoirs and around, I think it's like 1865, essentially. So this book that he publishes is going to account for what he saw his escape at the White House would actually happen in 1814. And from that book he wrote, we have this quote here. So essentially, he talks about his account that it was him that took, that gave the order. He was the one that got the ladder, got the portrait down. He very carefully cut the portrait out of the frame, rolled it up, and he was the one that stored it in Dolly's things before they were getting ready to leave the White House here. So as this new thing comes about, it really goes back to this core question. So what do we really think that happened in this scenario? And essentially, who should get credit for saving the famous George Washington portrait that we have today, right? Is it the person that has the idea that says, I need this many people to do this, this, and this, and we're not leaving without it? Or is it the person that actually does the work to save the portrait? And essentially, like, who benefits from each story, right? Dolly benefits from this story, I think, a lot because people know it. It's very popular. But Paul Jennings, right, his story is not going to come out till much, much later. So his story kind of gets pushed underneath Dolly and all of her credit that she's going to be given. So the case 2 that we'll talk about is essentially what is wrong with Ida McKinley. So she is the one that we have at our site that we kind of talk about. We have her house that was constructed in 1840 and a lot of her artifacts as well. So unfortunately, so Ida McKinley was actually a very active and intelligent woman. She enjoyed lots of things like hiking. She believed in lots of women's rights. She's going to receive a master's degree in fine arts. Her parents believed that she should be able to make her own living and be, standoffish, very intelligent without the help of a man. So she was very, very intelligent, and she brought a lot of that to her time as at the White House. But unfortunately, she is going to get an illness. So after the birth of her second child, things sort of begin to change for Ida. So by the age of 26, she becomes extremely ill. She's going to be diagnosed by doctors with frequent seizures and epilepsy. But epilepsy at this point is not going to be shared with the public. Unfortunately, epilepsy was often referred to, it went hand in hand with female hysteria, or even so far as, like demonic sort of things. So epilepsy is never going to be disclosed during this time just because of the bad stigma it comes with. But she is also going to experience, at the same time she gets really sick, a lot of death in her family very quickly. So her first engagement is actually going to pass before she marries President McKinley. Her 2 daughters are also going to die within just 3 years of each other as well. So they have 2 daughters, Kate and Ida. Kate passes around the age of 5, and little Ida a couple months after she was born. And then on top of that, she's going to lose both her mother and her grandmother as well before they move into the White House. So in the short amount of time, not only is she sick, but she experiences quite a lot of death in her family as well. So after that time, her symptoms start to get worse. She lost a lot of her strength in both of her right and left legs. So she often requires the use of a cane. She has the seizures, headaches, and also a stroke as well, in addition to what the doctors referred to as other ailments. But we're not really sure what other ailments really meant at this time. What the doctors did is essentially they put Ida on bromides and lithiums to help control her seizures. And also it was believed if you were a woman in the 1800s and you were extremely active, which Ida was, they believed that that could cause seizures. So since Ida was active, the doctors were like, well, we probably should make you stop that. So essentially is what they're going to do is they're going to actually inject her with heavy sedatives daily as well. So she's basically sedated during her whole time at the White House. Unfortunately, the doctors are essentially going to poison her. But during this time also, it's very well known that McKinley was a loving and devoted, they had a loving and devoted relationship to each other. McKinley often changed his whole schedule around to be with her, and the presidential campaign capitalized on this to kind of show voters what kind of person McKinley was, that he was extremely compassionate. So that does work. And he wins the presidential nomination here. But during this time as presidency, unfortunately, Ida's sickness worsens during her time in the presidency, right? She's having migraine seizures and she's sometimes even unable to walk, but she still wants to be involved. She doesn't want to be completely overturn her official duties over to someone else. So a lot of the time she still was in attendance. She hosted plays and musicals. In both actually Canton and Washington. She hosted previous first ladies as well. So she did quite a lot of things during her time as first lady. But her husband was always right there in case she needed any help. They did a lot of stuff to help mask her seizures as well. So if she were ever to be receiving guests, she would either have one of her fans in her right hand or a bouquet of flowers to prevent people from noticing that she is having a little bit of a hard time. But things are going to turn around for Ida a little bit. So they get a new doctor during her time in the White House, Dr. Rixley. So he begins to treat Ida. And essentially what he does is he takes her off all those crazy medications the doctors had her on. And all he does is really focus on diet, sleep, and nutrition. And after that, we don't have a record of Ida having another seizure ever again after this time, right? Shocker, right? They stop poisoning her and she doesn't have any problems after that. So at this point, Dr. Rixley becomes essentially one of the first White House physicians. So he is going to be the person that's going to be treating Ida every single day, at least 2 times. If she ever has any problems, he's going to be the main doctor. And he became a very close family friend of the McKinleys, and President McKinley couldn't sing good enough praises about him. But unfortunately, Ida's going to experience one more loss in 1901. So her husband is going to be shot at the World's Fair, and he's going to die 8 days later from an infection. During this time, medicine was not the best. And essentially, after McKinley died, it was reported here that Ida never had another seizure ever again. So she was actually visited by multiple doctors that wrote this down, that she never had any issues. She started walking better, all this kind of stuff. She actually had a great 6 years after her husband passed. That's how long she lived before she passed away. And she was in relatively good health as well. So this comes to the question, what was essentially wrong with Ida McKinley? People actually speculate, was she actually sick? And who really benefited from her being visually ill as First Lady? So a lot of people think that, right, it was essentially the doctor that were poisoning her. Some people think that it was just the stress of being First Lady. Some people think it was all the losses she experienced and she was really worried. Her number one fear was that her husband was going to be taken from her as well. And unfortunately that came to pass. So after, she wasn't worrying about that anymore, she got better too. So we're not really sure. But essentially who benefited from her being sort of ill during her time as First Lady, I really think that her husband did. Not only did the public kind of get to know her during this time, but the presidential campaign capitalized on her essentially being ill, because they used that to kind of like boast up McKinley, that he was a loving and devoted husband, that he was making all these changes for her, and people really got to see the real him and really connect with Ida as well. So so a lot of people say that the presidency really benefited from them kind of saying that Ida was sick. So we'll go on to case study number 3. And this one, we're going to focus on President Edith Wilson. That's going to be kind of our case here. So Edith Wilson was married to President Woodrow Wilson in December of 1915. And after becoming First Lady, after only 2 years after that, the country is going to enter World War I. So things are going to change for both of this couple quite quickly here. So during this stressful time of World War I, it actually led to Woodrow Wilson's declining health. So with his declining health, he went on a train tour of the country after the war to sort of encourage the support of the League of Nations. So what he did is he's going to travel over 8,000 miles in just 22 days. And his doctor said this was not a good idea. They were encouraging him to stop or at least slow down a little bit. And while he was on this tour, he's actually going to have a small stroke in September, but his doctors are going to say that he's going to recover quickly, and then he's going to continue advocating on for the League of Nations. So he's not going to slow down. But his headaches are going to become more of a daily occurrence, his doctors are going to note, and he's not going to be sleeping anymore. So by the end of this long tour, the public is actually starting to notice the president's decline in appearance, saying that he can hardly stand without any support here. So as you can see in this photo, you can kind of actually see his decline in sort of his face. He looks really tired. So he returned to the White House in extremely bad health, his doctors are going to record. So on October 2nd of 1919, he's going to have a serious stroke, so more than the previous one. And Edith Wilson was a fierce and loyal supporter to her husband and blames his poor health actually on the disloyalty of his White House and just the stress of the office in general. So essentially after this, Edith Wilson becomes essentially his guardian, right? So she only allows certain people to see him, but she's not going to be sort of alone in this kind of plan. She's going to have a very important ally, Dr. Cary Grayson, and he's going to be the Surgeon General and the friend to Woodrow Wilson. So essentially the doctor that's going to be taking care of him. So there is the doctor right there, the handsome young fellow that's going to be taking care of the president. And so essentially what Dr. Grayson is going to do is he's going to stay quiet about the severity of sort of Wilson's stroke, very similarly to what we just talked about with the McKinleys. And he's going to stay quiet about the stroke until and his condition until he kind of makes more of a recovery. So by doing this, the administration is going to avoid the sort of big question of the qualification that Woodrow Wilson has or the succession who would come next after him if he's no longer fit. So however, during this time, the big rumor is going to sort of speculate of, it was believed that it was actually Edith Wilson that was the one who was running the presidency sort of behind closed doors. So there she is right there helping her husband. So essentially from October 1919 until March 1921, she was the one who stood between everyone and the president. So she guarded and prevented anyone from entering the president's room without her presence or her permission. So any important documents were to be handled by her. She would be the one to decide if the president needed to review them. She didn't want Wilson to have to read really anything. She just wanted him to sort of rest and relax. So she would actually read the documents out loud to him, perhaps deciding what information he really needed to know at that point. So after the Secretary of State held a meeting with other officials and cabinet members discussing the situation of a possible succession of the vice president, it was at this time where Edith really told him that he needed to resign his time as presidency, and he did after that. So essentially, this is a quote that we have from Edith Wilson, right? She studied every paper sent from different secretaries, and she would basically be the one standing between the public and the president, right? Her husband. So she was basically making important decisions, what would pass the president's desk as well, just because she was very concerned about his health. So essentially, we have this question, right? Who was the president? What role does the first lady actually play? And people, people have this big question, like, does the public have any concerns about this way it was handled, right? His health was kind of hush hush. The public probably should have known he was in declining health, and maybe the vice president should have had a succession. But this case really kind of shows, I really think, the strength of the first lady, right? A lot of people think that some of the earlier first ladies, they were kind of more passive. They weren't really doing a whole lot. But I really think that this shows the strength of the first lady, right? What she can do. She's not just someone that stands there and looks pretty for the public, but they also can make, important decisions and essentially be a co-president, right? Someone who is there to support the president in anything that they might need. And then this last one we'll talk about here is what happened to Mary Lincoln. And I think this might be one of the most not knowledgeable ones, but like what historians have really focused on. There's a lot of material written out on this as well. And I know definitely history textbooks in like our high schools and stuff even talk about this as well. So before we kind of get into this, we'll kind of talk about a little brief biography about Mary here. So Mary Lincoln was born in 1818, and sort of similar to Ida McKinley, right? She is actually going to experience losses as well. So her mother's going to die just when she's 6 years old. So essentially, she's going to grow up in sort of like a blended family. Her other family members are going to step in and help take care of her. And then later in 1842, right, she's going to marry Abraham Lincoln, and they're going to have 4 kids together. So the beginning of these many tragedies of her adult life is going to start in 1849 with the death of their son, Eddie. He was just 4 years old when he died of tuberculosis. And obviously this was something that was running rampant in the 1800s, right? We didn't really have a control or really knew what was like sort of going on. So unfortunately, a lot of children are going to die from tuberculosis during this time. And Abraham Lincoln, after this, is going to be basically his wife's kind of like protector, right? She's going to go through a period of depression, and he is going to be the one that's going to help her through this time. But this is when rumors about her instability are going to become rampant during time of Abraham Lincoln's campaign. And there's even a story that kind of comes around where she's going to be chasing her husband down the street with a butcher knife. I don't think that really happened, but these are sort of the rumors that are going to speculate against Mary Lincoln that are going to start this early. So there she is in one of her iconic First Lady outfits. And her time in the White House, there were frequent reports about her unstable behavior. So unknown to her husband, Mary Lincoln was in debt. She was in debt about $70,000 during the 1800s there. And she purchased with credit furniture, clothing, other household accessories as well that she felt were necessary or essential to keep up with the appearances of what the president's wife should look like. So that's why she's often pictured in wearing fancy clothes, the finest gloves, right, jewelry, because that's how she thought the First Lady should look. And so that's why she was in a lot of debt. So she believed that she would have more time at her time in the White House to sort of like settle these debts. But as we know, her time in the White House is going to be cut very short. So in the middle of this time period, Willie Lincoln actually is going to die from what we now know is malaria. And this only sort of worsens Mary's condition, right? She's going to lose another one of her children. So she shares with both her husband and her sister that she's experiencing like sort of like visual I can't say the word, I can't think of the word, but hallucination. There we go. And she's going to actually write in her diary that she is going to see Willie Lincoln, so her son that just passed. She's going to say that he comes to me every night at the foot of my bed, smiling that sweet smile that he always does. And sometimes little Eddie is with him as well. So she's not only seeing one of her sons, but she's now seeing both of them as well. And that's where these kind of rumors are going to spread, so far as even Julia Grant here as well. So during her time at the White House, it was known to some that she's actually going to hold like seances in the White House and attempt to talk to her dead sons. And this is an extremely uncommon practice during this time as well. Spiritualism is popular, but this is not common at this time. So this is kind of not only going to kind of boast these rumors up as Mary Lincoln's, you know, she's going sort of like crazy, she's losing it, she's not really fit to be in the White House at this time. So that, yeah, that's the quote over there. And then she is going to experience quite a lot of things. So after her husband is assassinated, and he's going to be assassinated in April of 1865 at the Ford's Theater. And right, so Mary Lincoln is sitting next to her husband, and essentially what happens, right, he's assassinated and she is just covered in her husband's blood. And I think for anyone that would be an extremely traumatic experience, right? She's already lost two of her sons, and now she's played witness to her husband's murder as well. So the days following this, she is going to be inconsolable after these couple of days. And it's known that after this, she's going to have severe, severe headaches where she's not going to get out of bed. She's going to have big episodes of depression and outbursts. And then this is also where this frequent spending comes as well. A lot of historians believe that this was sort of more of her coping mechanism. So as she's experiencing more losses, she's racking up more and more debt, essentially. So this is sort of the famous portrait that we have of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln here. And this is sort of where the speculation against Mary Lincoln sort of gets worse. So, and to top that all off, right, this brings us up to speed. So Mary Lincoln is also going to lose her son, Tad Lincoln, as well after the death of her husband, right? So even leaving her even more in this sort of depressive state. So Robert Todd Lincoln, her only living son at this point, is going to arrange an actual hearing of insanity for her, which was very common in the 1800s. And this is going to go on for around 7 months or so, where they're going to be kind of like discussing all of this, all of the cases against her. And she is going to go into sort of like a private sanatorium in Illinois after the hearing. A second hearing is going to be happening in 1876, which is revised the earlier finding of insanity and ended basically, it left her essentially publicly humiliated that she was going through all of this. So she's going to spend kind of her next 4 years in Europe, returning in the late 1880s to Springfield, where she's going to remain in sort of like declining health until her eventual death in 1882. She'll be buried alongside her husband at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield. And essentially what comes from this is a huge advocate for Mary Lincoln, and the appeal of her second hearing was Myra. And she was a journalist, publisher, activist, all sorts of things. And essentially she's going to kind of set the way for how things are going to change. So during the 1800s, it was very common for these insanity hearings to be for women, right? Hysteria on women was a very big thing. And Myra sort of sets the precedence to how those will be looked at, not locking women up, right? Where they can't see their families, right? Locking them in a private sanatorium. So she's going to be kind of lead the way to kind of stop those kinds of things. And she was a huge advocate for Mary. So due to the many letters that we have actually between Myra and Mary, Myra often would have wrote to family members in a similar manner as the quote is shown here. Essentially, she is saying she cannot imagine the sort of stress and stuff that Mary Lincoln has gone through. Essentially, Rob Todd Lincoln, right, sent her to sort of this insane asylum. And, after that, she is pretty much known as, Mary Lincoln went crazy, or she was completely unstable and stuff. And this is going to be basically cemented in history, right? If you look up Mary Lincoln, I guarantee a lot of the stuff is going to come up is about her health, her insanity, all this stuff, because people were very fascinated about this as well. So that's where a lot of the popular historical narrative is unfortunately going to go for Mary Lincoln, is that she's going to be insane, all this kind of stuff, and it's going to ruin her public reputation. But essentially, so what happened to Mary Lincoln, right? I kind of like to take the sort of route that, right, she was an ordinary woman, right? She had a series of losses. She's going to lose, most of her children. That's traumatic in itself. She's going to witness her husband's assassination, which I don't know, right? The average person could even imagine what that would feel like. But I assume that any person that would experience any of that stuff, right, they would be depressed. They would have these episodes of not wanting to leave the house, not wanting to visit their friends and family and stuff. And essentially the people around her, right, the public chalked her up to being insane, to where her only living son essentially puts her in a sane asylum for, being sort of depressed. So I think that Mary Lincoln she gets a really bad rap. But really, I just think that she was someone who was under a lot of stress, under a lot of pressure, and seen things that, no one should ever see. So I think historians put her under, essentially under the bus a lot of the times they write about her. So that is the last one I have, the last of the case studies here. So now what I'm going to do is, if anyone has any questions, we can either go case by case and kind of discuss and kind of like what you guys think, or if there's more specific questions, I can answer those too. I will.
Thank you so much, Tara. That was wonderful. We do have a question in the chat already. You find it. Regarding Dolly Madison saving the Gilbert Stuart George Washington portrait in the War of 1812. The question is, did Dolly Madison order it to be removed, even if she didn't see it actually taken down?
Essentially, yes, or at least that's the way the story goes, is that Dolly would not leave the White House until that portrait was taken down. So she would have given the order essentially to take it down, but we don't know if she was actually in the room and she was actually part of that process. It kind of makes us think that she really wasn't, and she just said, take the portrait down, and put it with my stuff, and I'll be sort of in the carriage, waiting for it. But I don't think she was not the actual one to do the hard labor to take it down. That was other people.
Sounds reasonable. Okay, I don't see another question in the chat, but if you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your question, or put it in the chat and I'll read it, or use the raise hand function. Okay, here we go. Another question is, if women were not supposed to have diaries, correspondence, etc., in the early 1800s, how do we have Abigail Adams' many letters?
Ooh, that's a good question. So yeah, so it was true that women were not supposed to keep diaries, correspondence. Like I said, Martha Washington burned a lot of her personal correspondence, and a lot of other women during this time did as well. But Abigail Adams is sort of like the outlier. During her time as First Lady, she was a very rebellious woman, essentially. She didn't really play things by the book. She kind of did things that were outside of the social norm during this point. So it's not really surprising that she made that decision to keep her letters. That's just very canny with her time as First Lady, and sort of like her personality that we have records of.
I have a question. The questioner says, thanks. I have a question about Edith Wilson carrying
Yes.
on for Woodrow Wilson. My understanding is that he actually had the Spanish flu when he was and was dying, and she took over for him. I mean, where was the controversy? Whether she actually did take over for him behind the scenes, or I'm not sure what the controversy was.
Essentially, the controversy, there was a couple of controversies. One is that some people knew that the president was sick, but they weren't really releasing a lot of the stuff. So they thought that he was making these decisions, but really it was his wife that was doing so. So they didn't really know who was in charge. So they were kind of like skewing the truth about that. Some people knew that Edith was making all these decisions and didn't think that was right. That she was essentially being the president, and that the vice president should have stepped in at that point. Essentially, she was giving to her husband like what she thought was important, what she thought he should look at. But she wasn't acting alone, right? She was also, meeting with his officials, the board members, all these sort of stuff that the president would have met with as well. But she was just sort of like more filling in. So she wasn't actually like making these decisions like herself, like a dictator would. She was always answering, to a cabinet of people.
Okay, we have another question asking, can you speak a bit about the difference between First Lady and First Hostess?
So the terms kind of go interchangeably, but how we use them at our site. So First Lady is essentially the spouse of the president, right? So sometimes, the president either has one wife, and if she passes, he might have another. So that's who we would consider First Lady, is the spouse of the president. But who we consider as First Hostess is, not a lot of people know that there are more First Ladies than there were presidents. And this is where this term First Hostess kind of comes in. So First Hostess is referred to anyone that was helping out in the presidency. Could have been a sister of the president, could have been a niece of the president, right? A cousin. So all of these other females from the family that were helping out. For instance, Ida McKinley, right? When she was sort of ill, she brought some of her female family members in to sort of play this role as hostess. She would always schedule, and plan everything, but it was like her sister that would like actually execute and be sort of like the face. So that's where the term First Hostess comes in, is where the First Lady is asking more help of their female family, essentially, if that makes sense.
Okay, anybody else have a question? Yes, we have a hand raised again. Melanie.
Oh, hi, I think that's mine. Again, to go back to Mrs. Wilson, to the second Mrs. Wilson. So we really only have her word of what was transpiring between herself and her husband during these discussions behind closed doors. So she could say whatever she wanted to say in her diary and her biography or autobiography, but we don't know. Is that a correct statement? There
Yeah,
was no objective third party that was saying, oh yeah, this was the deal. We're just taking her word for it, right?
Yeah, essentially, yes. No one really challenged her word or what she was saying. I'm not sure if just because people knew what was happening, or if they were, the more likely scenario is that they knew how in bad health the president was, so they weren't really contradicting anything she had to say.
So we honestly don't know.
Yeah, we honestly don't know.
Interesting. Thank you.
We have another very excellent question in the chat. When did the First Lady start having an office and a staff?
Ooh, so that one I'm not exactly sure about. I know Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady to sort of expand the office beyond like social and like administrative sort of like roles, and like she hired staff that would help out. But I mean, like the office of the first lady has changed so much, you know, since Martha Washington, and we actually have a full program on that. So it's really kind of hard to say like this is the definitive date on when the first lady started like having office or having like staff, because each first lady kind of came in and she said, this is what I want to do. It doesn't matter who did this before or sort of what, it was just sort of what they wanted to do at their time in first lady. So often there wasn't like a set standard or really expectations until honestly more of like the modern first ladies, like the sort of like the office of the first lady didn't have an official like seal until I think Melania Trump. She was the one that made the official first lady's seal that we have today in the White House. So honestly, it's an ever changing and evolving position, I think more so than the presidency, right? The president has all these expectations and duties that he has to do for the nation, but the first lady essentially has a lot more free range and liberty about what she wants to do, what action she wants to take. So it's kind of just up to the individual, I would say.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat, but please feel free, either use the raise hand function in Zoom or just unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, going once. Last question. Here we go. We have somebody says, thank you. I say thank you too. No, I guess no more questions. Thank you very, very much, Ranger Tara. This was superb and very, very interesting, thought-provoking. Wonder what the true story is. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Thank you from all of us for coming to us virtually from Canton, Ohio at the First Lady's National Historic Site. We appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Be well. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.